Hello, everybody. I realize that there are still a few people finding their lunch, so take your time. Um, it's always great to have so many people show up for these seminars. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government, um, and I'm trying to decide if the reason we have this massive turnout, and we have a lot of people online as well, is because of the quality of the panel, which I'm sure is a vast part of the reason. But then there's also I've concluded that a free lunch is a free lunch, and students always love a free lunch. We have a lot to talk about today. The title is The Great Energy Divide, Petro America versus Electro China. Obviously, an important hot topic. I will leave Edo Campanella is one of the senior research fellows within the Kennedy School's Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I will let him introduce our panelists, other than to say Yasheng is a professor of global economics and management at the Sloan School down at MIT, written like 11 books, if I remember right, something like that. 12 now, and all like worth reading, definitely worth reading. Elaine is a lecturer within the FAS, I guess, in economics, but also a research fellow at the Salata Institute. And my background is extensive time in the private sector, 25 years. And I appreciate that Elaine was the chief economist for General Motors for many years, and so brings an interesting kind of perspective from the firm side of the equation. But with that, I will turn it over to Edo to guide us through this discussion.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, John, and good afternoon, everyone. Before we get into the conversation, let me briefly explain to you why we were motivated to do this panel. So basically, the idea is to try to understand the economic and geopolitical implication of China and the US undertaking apparently two different energy paths. I think there will be some disagreement on exactly the direction, but basically we have the US that seems to be stuck in the old energy playbook, focus on traditional fossil fuels, whereas China is more focused on the full electrification of its economy, and it's trying to expand also the role of renewables. And since we know from history that energy plays a major role, not only as a driver of economic growth, but also from a geopolitical perspective, we will try to dissect this different dimension in our conversation. I think it might be useful to start with Elaine, and we can focus, we start the conversation talking about the US. So we saw with the Trump administration in its first year that basically there was a pullback in terms of policy support for renewable. In particular, there was a discontinuity with the Biden administration. Can you explain us what are the implications of this policy shift when it comes to the electrification of the US economy? Is it slowing down? You don't think has any material impact?
So I think there are two things we want to look at here. One is policies towards renewable energy generation. And the second is policies towards electric vehicles, because when we're talking about electrifying the US economy, that's overwhelmingly about on-road transportation. There's a little bit over there in heat pumps. And there's no question that the Trump administration has pulled back both policy support and thrown obstacles in front of renewable generation, and at the same time pulled back a lot of policy support for EVs. And just to be more clear about why I'm so focused on transportation, if you think about petroleum use in the US, 2/3 is transportation, fully half of the total, 50% of the total US oil use is on-road transportation. Like then you end up using it in things like aviation. The remaining is about 30% industrial. So that's to some extent using stuff in plants, but it's much more using it as feedstocks for like plastics and petrochemicals. So let's start with EVs. EVs have faced just a wide range of hits from Trump administration policy. I think that I know the Trump administration would say that they are trying to be more technology neutral and avoid creating policy pressure and make it more market based. But they have frozen bipartisan infrastructure law funding for charger layouts. Some of that has been overruled by the courts, but other parts not yet. Eliminated tax credits for both the purchases of EVs as well as charger installation by households and businesses through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Announced new fuel economy rules that take away pressure on automakers to shift their mix of new vehicle sales towards EVs. And they've also revoked California's waiver that allowed it to set tougher emissions and greenhouse gas emissions rules, and other states to follow that. That is also in the courts. And automakers have responded powerfully, and particularly to the December announcement of the fuel economy rules. To be clear, it's a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's still getting comments. It's not final. But in the weeks and months after that early December announcement, GM announced $7 billion in write-downs of investments for 19.5 billion. And on Friday, Stellantis 26.5 billion, saying, they're all saying, well, we're not going to move as quickly on EV sales due to policy changes in the consumer. And so we're delaying programs, don't expect the same revenues. Now, the market actually was pretty punishing to Stellantis, though. 1/3, 25% drop in stock price on Friday, no recovery this morning. So that tells you there are differing views out there. But with respect to renewable energy, let's just talk for a minute about wind and solar. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act moved up deadlines to get tax credits that were in IRA, both in terms of sunsetting the programs and how fast you needed to actually turn it on. Department of Interior has introduced a lot of hurdles to slow the development of wind or solar that involves leases on federal land, including funneling approvals through the Secretary of Interior himself, which creates quite a bottleneck, and pausing offshore wind. On the other hand, tax credits from IRA for geothermal, batteries, and nuclear remain unchanged. So there's some policy mix there.
Okay, so shifting our attention to China. China has been defined, I don't know if you agree with this definition, as the first true electro state in the world. Electro state does not mean being a green state, because China produces a big chunk of its electricity with fossil fuels, in particular with coal. But what's happening in China right now is not happening by chance. It's been orchestrated by the government for many years. So can you explain us how this technological transformation has played out in China, the role the government also played?
So I'm not an energy expert, so I defer to Elaine on energy, but I'll come to that. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that divide that you have laid out. One is Petro state, the other is electro state. I think, in terms of the EVs, solar panels, yes, China is a big producer of those products. But if you look at the energy base, right, still, 60% of the energy base is coming from coal. That has dramatically declined over the past 20 years. But in terms of the sort of the green sustainability, it's not just the energy mix, it's really the level of energy. The fact is that China is building alternative sources of energy, as well as the fossil energy source simultaneously. So we're not doing subtraction, we're doing addition. And in terms of the global footprint on CO2s and all of that, China now is emitting twice as much as Europe and the United States. So it's not really sort of producing. I mean, we focus on the EVs and BYD and all of that. We can come back to that later on. But just in terms of this, I don't think there's a transition going on. There's a addition that is going on, but not a transition. So I think that's a critical distinction we need to make. How exactly are they able to make that transition? That's a separate issue. Another big energy source in China is hydro. And we don't see much of that in the United States. In terms of the alternative sustainable sources of energy, the two countries, just in terms of the mix, are not that different from each other. Right? So the US is natural gas, China is coal. So the hydro is the big differentiator. In terms of the EVs, solar panels, this is a part of China as a dominant manufacturing power. So I want to make that distinction because there's a view that there is a set of industrial policy in place in China that supports green transition. The other day, I was giving a lecture to a group of Taiwanese executives, and one of them came up to me after the lecture and said, well, Yasheng, you know what? We're in the toilet paper business. China has an overcapacity in toilet paper. So this is overcapacity across the board, rather than a targeted industrial policy supporting green transition. There may be that is going on, but to me, this is a second order effect. The first order effect is this massive buildup of manufacturing capacity. Essentially, if you take the size of the Chinese manufacturing sales, it is bigger than the next 9 manufacturing economies combined. So this is not just solar panels bigger than the rest of the 9 economies combined. This is across the board, including, according to this Taiwanese executive, toilet paper, right? So, and energy production has a huge energy, the manufacturing capacity requires a massive energy investment. So China generates twice the level of the total energy as the United States. So it is a overwhelmingly energy generating, energy using country. Secondarily, maybe there's a transition, but even there, we need to be careful about, whether or not the transition is taking place by the Chinese EVs within China or outside of China. Chinese EVs are quite export dependent. They are not coming to the US, but they are about to come to Canada, and they are going to Europe. And in fact, they have come to the US, but mostly in the form of buses. There are buses in the US that are produced by BYD. And so that energy saving effect of the consumption effect happens outside of China. I think the energy mix in China is still quite heavily weighted toward fossil fuel, and this energy capacity, the manufacturing capacity requires a lot of energy investment. So that's the way I put it. Yeah.
Can I do a little level setting based on data between
Yeah.
the two economies?
Yeah, if I may, yeah, okay, go.
All right, so just to give you a context. So first of all, US is the world's #1 user of oil. We use about 25% of the petroleum used in the world economy. China's next at 15%, and it drops all the way down to about 5% after that for India. But China uses more energy. You said the US uses almost twice as much per capita, but generally has been gliding down. China's on a big upswing in terms of use per capita as income continue to go up. So it's up. US is down 7% since 2000. China up 550%. When I've had the privilege through Harvard to be in a variety of meetings with Chinese energy experts, and they talk about build out of the electric grid, they said they plan to double capacity over about the next 10 years. And a lot of that added capacity would be renewables. But if you look at the fossil versus renewable mixes in the two economies today, Overall, similar on fossil, China around 85%, US around 80% using IEA data, so fairly comparable. But China's mostly coal, as you said, around 60% coal out of total use. The US is about 36% for each of oil and natural gas. So, you know, different mixes, probably a little bit of a higher emission mix in China with all that coal. And neither one really uses oil and electricity generations. And electricity generation is in the US, like to what extent can we go mostly from natural gas towards renewables, and in China from coal toward renewables. Also say, just come on to say, like the US has been since the 1970s trying to reduce dependence on foreign oil. China's much earlier in that process, but that's been a big policy target. The difference is that the US always had oil and now is the #1 oil producer. And China has very little domestically sourced oil and has often been challenged to get the oil it's needed. And, you know, many reports indicate is arguably unwilling to look at oil from sanctioned powers.
And if I may, strategically, from the perspective of China, it can be good to focus more on electric vehicles because even if they produce dirty electricity with coal, coal is produced domestically. So they don't have any sort of dependency with the rest of the world. What would they would otherwise have with oil, for example, for traditional
Well,
cars?
they are also beginning to, or they have done that, importing coal.
They do import, yes.
Yeah, so it's not that they're complete. I mean, part of going back to Elaine's point, part of their energy mix strategy is about not so much about transition. Green transition is really about reducing foreign dependency.
Yeah.
Right. So you want to reduce coal dependency because they were importing a lot of coal from Australia. You want to reduce the oil dependency because extracting oil in China is extremely costly and expensive. So you develop these alternative sources of energy mix. They may have the salutary effect on climate and all of that, but in terms of strategic consideration, is about that. Right?
If I may, just for clarity, because I had a different perspective on the success of Chinese industrial policy towards the development of the electric vehicle industry. If I'm not mistaken, Beijing identified electric vehicles as a strategic sector already in 2001, when they realized they could not compete with Western brands for traditional cars. And at some point in China, I think there were something like 800, 900 producers of electric vehicles.
Now fewer. Yeah.
Now much fewer because there was a sort of selection process. Yeah. And BYD is widely considered to be the best electric vehicle producer in the world right now. So to me, it seems that it was clearly targeted and also pretty successful as a policy. So, but from what you said before, it seems it was just the result of boosting the manufacturing sector without a clear strategy. But I want to see exactly what you mean.
So there's an economic way of looking at this, and there's an engineering way of looking at this. In terms of the engineering way, it is a tremendous success, right? The BYD and NIO and the electric battery production in China. So by the way, there's a local story here. The professor at MIT who developed the A123 systems in the early 2000s, it was an incredible piece of electric battery technology, but none of the US companies was able to scale the technology. GM couldn't do it, Ford couldn't do it. And it was sold to a Chinese company at fair market price, which is close to zero, because if you cannot scale the technology, then technology by definition has no value, commercial value. And now the company, Yasheng, which bought the technology now is the world's biggest industrial storage company in the world, right? So we have to talk about that, why they are able to succeed in scaling, whereas we have failed in scale. We are very good at coming up with breakthrough technologies and inventions, but we have systematically failed in scaling the technology. The Chinese industrial policy is extremely good at scaling. And they, in part, target the areas where the US has not been very good at scaling. I was involved with a solar company coming out of MIT for the last 15 years, and I see the history of this company. It's all about inventions. It's all about R&D. When they scale, they have tremendous problems scaling. So in the US, if we don't talk about the Trump administration's policy, we have to start talking about why we are not very good at scaling, whereas China is very good at scaling. And that difference explains the difference that we are seeing now in EV, in solar, and windmills.
Okay, I'm happy to address that in a second, but I want to just give some comments on what that industrial policy looked like in China. Because our colleagues at MIT CEPR, the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, did a great study where they tried to quantify all the subsidies given in China, in the EU, and in the US for EVs. And they tried to also capture the value of credit subsidies that may be harder to identify in China because it's below market loans from state-owned banks.
Yeah, sure.
So one, they don't go back all the way to 2000, but they do show that the level of subsidies went up vastly higher and earlier, that the peak levels, which they're sort of hovering around, are far higher than either China or the US, either Europe or the US has arrived at. This is across direct subsidies, fiscal subsidies to companies, subsidies to consumers for purchase, including tax subsidies, below market credit. This is a wide range of tools. And that shakeout might be down from 800, but you're still over 100 companies. So you have some real winners and you have some that really sort of don't die because there's not the market-based credit enforcement. So it's policy that's been very successful, but also is willing to spend on a number of failures.
So, Elaine, I don't mean to be critical of my MIT colleagues, but I don't think they are aware. They are not even beginning to describe the scope of the issue we're talking about.
It wouldn't surprise me if it underestimates. However, nonetheless, shows that it's much higher.
So the biggest subsidy has nothing to do with the fiscal grants and bank credits and things like that. The biggest subsidy is in two forms. One is the land grants, okay? Because when you produce these things, these are land-intensive activities.
Right.
And the other is really the subsidy from the labor to the capital. So if you calculate the wage and salaries as a share of the manufacturing output, of 87 countries for which we have data, China is ranked from the bottom, number 2, only higher than Indonesia, which is about 3.5%. 3.5% of the manufacturing output goes to the workforce. For China, it's about 4.3, right? So essentially, US is about 12%, India is 5%. So we're talking about a huge, massive capital surplus, regardless whether or not you are producing EVs or solars and things like that. So all the other things that my colleagues are focusing on are specific to those industries. That doesn't even begin to explain this across the board overcapacity of China. So essentially, China has about 35% of the manufacturing capacity globally. China has 18% of the global share of the population. China has 11% of the consumption share, right? So this is not, so my point is, this is not unique to solars and EVs, and this is an economy-wide issue.
And it is something that works until the rest of the world is willing to absorb this excess capacity.
Yeah, so that's going to be a sort of thorny issue going forward. When you are producing 35%, you're consuming 11%. Where does that 24% go in good geopolitical environment, in bad geopolitical environment?
And I would like maybe to go there with Elaine, because one big issue that we have in Europe as well is how to deal with this excess capacity. And I mean, it's generalized, but let's stick for a moment with electric vehicles. When we deal with China, we have two problems essentially. First, we need there is the need to defend domestic industries from the competition. But the other problem is that, for example, for electric vehicles, companies need to have access to critical minerals that are controlled by China. So there are these two dimensions of the problem. So here in the US, how do you think the government should approach this competition coming from China from one hand, and also the dependencies that there are on China for these minerals?
So first, I would say that I believe that the future of the auto industry is EVs. And so you need to define your policy in that direction. If you're thinking, if you want to think about an industrial policy approach, then you need to assume that that's where industry is going. And how do we create policies that would create a sustainable auto industry? You could decide you didn't want to do that, but I think there are several reasons why you want to do so. So first of all, as I said, a lot of this non-market credit to Chinese companies means that the shakeout's extended and you have this much longer lasting price war, and you don't want your companies to be US auto production to be killed during a short-term shakeout caused by these subsidies that are being very gradually withdrawn. Secondly, if you want to be supporting the auto industry through this transition, you want to maintain policies that consistently drive towards EV production. And we've seen real swinging back and forth, where the first EV tax credits were actually introduced under the Obama administration. During the financial crisis, the Trump administration pulled those back. Biden administration went much more aggressive with a wider range of policies. Trump administration has pulled that back. And that constantly shifting policy means that the companies are going back and forth between sort of, and in response to financial markets, between I need to be ambitious in terms of establishing my stake and my foothold into this EV industry, that's the future industry, and I want to maximize my short-term profits, including to pay for that very expensive transition. So I would say stable policy oriented towards EVs, but narrowly targeted on EVs. Invest especially in batteries and battery development, because that is really the decider, batteries and technology and research. And so those would be some of my recommendations. I think we have to recognize another thing here that's getting, I think, increased airplay with with Canada's willingness to take in 49,000 Chinese EVs, is that there is an issue that vehicles, EVs and otherwise, are increasingly electronic. They increasingly carry cameras. There are cybersecurity risks and there are surveillance risks. So the US has also put in place the connected vehicle rule, a rule that started under the Trump administration and finished under the Biden administration, that limits the sale of any vehicle with either Chinese or Russian, but basically Chinese-made communication technologies or entire units. So we've sort of said no Chinese vehicle sales in this country, even before we get to things like tariffs.
And yeah, this is always a complicated policy dilemma, because at the end of the day, you are penalizing consumers, and who's benefiting from these policies are the shareholders of the companies that are getting protected. Assuming that this national security issue is not as big as sometimes people in the national security community in DC wants to paint.
There are two national security issues. One is the surveillance issue. The other is having a sophisticated, heavy industry manufacturing base that has the potential to transition in the case we needed more defense capacity. You can look back to World War II, and GM and Ford stopped making cars and they made airplanes, but you can look to COVID and who can suddenly make ventilators. Maybe we didn't actually prove to need them, but we thought we would. And so I think there's another defense issue in terms of, do you want to have a home auto industry and that sophisticated manufacturing in a decreasingly manufacturing intense economy?
But the EVs produced in China by Tesla, they do come to the US, no?
No, Tesla does not export to the US out of China. It exports somewhat to Europe out of China, but not to the US. And to be fair, this sort of connected vehicle rule originated in China. And China put a lot of limitations on where Teslas could be used and the use of Teslas by government officials in government facilities.
They are worried about surveillance too. Yeah.
So this is an international worry about cameras and cybersecurity.
Go.
Maybe it is more of a question. So in the case of TikTok, at least there was a solution. Whether or not solution was the effective one, we can have a debate. Why not coming up with a solution about surveillance as opposed to stopping the EVs coming to the US altogether?
If I may build on that, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, would it be okay, in your opinion, to try to attract the Chinese producer here in the US and forcing them to produce here, so just to reduce, to create
joint
a
ventures
level playing field, and maybe, and I'm not sure whether the Chinese producer would be happy with that, but increase the monitoring of the technologies that they embed in their vehicle here. So it's sort of what the US did with Japan in the 80s, where there weren't these national security concerns.
No, but I would say it's similar. It should be similar to what Chinese have been doing to the foreign companies, right? So
exactly.
You have to have a joint venture, and even the joint venture in which the foreign company has the majority stake, the chairman of the board has to be Chinese, and there should be a schedule of technology transfer. There's also additional data disclosure requirements on foreign companies operating in China. Once I made this argument to the U.S. government under the Biden administration, they wouldn't even listen. So my frustration is that there's not a more innovative thinking, short of just completely stopping Chinese cars from coming here. Do we have some sort of intermediate solutions that can take care of surveillance and security while taking advantage of the technology that Chinese companies have come up with? And maybe the proposal, my argument is that do what the Chinese have been doing to the US companies. But there's just there's no acceptance of that way of thinking.
So I've not thought about that before, but I think that, I would actually just slightly tweak your proposal, because in China, in those joint ventures, the Chinese company, which is generally state-owned enterprise, actually has the majority stake, slight majority stake. So imagine that you then apply that to the US. So the US company in a joint
Shanghai
venture
GM is 50-50.
No, I think SAIC has slightly more.
Okay.
Maybe it's 0.5%, but yeah, it's not 50-50. But imagine you could do that. That could be a way to get it done. Like, the Chinese have become very efficient. The single most brilliant thing China did in terms of scaling EV sales, which was actually happened at provincial levels, was that the biggest cities, that the only way you can register a new vehicle is if it's an EV or a plug-in hybrid. And most vehicle purchases in China are first-time purchases. It's either the person's never owned a car before or they're adding a second vehicle to their household. So this is a super powerful lever versus in the US, most people are trading it. It's like they already have a license plate, they can move on a new car. So that was super powerful in driving adoption of EVs in some of the biggest cities. So on your proposal, like Chinese companies have had the opportunity to scale a lot. So they've developed efficiencies in production. That's in EV production and that's in battery production, where learning is proven to be really important. So that scaling is really important. That has quite interesting potential. Also, Chinese automakers have been they're clean sheet manufacturers, which is to say they're sort of starting from the ground up, although they doubtless hired lots of people who worked in the international JVs. And so they've come up with probably efficiencies that you don't necessarily achieve when you're saying, I'm adapting from a whole bunch of existing processes and systems. And they have very sophisticated infotainment systems and sort of software-driven vehicle systems. And it's partly because the Chinese average vehicle buyer is about 35 years old, and the US average vehicle buyer is about new vehicle buyer, that is about 55. So the demands for that technology sophistication have just been higher in the Chinese market, and they've met it. And I think that there's a lot of cutting edge things that come in auto design out of China. And so I think that's a very interesting proposal. It's not one I've considered before. And I'm not enough an engineer or national security expert to say if that entirely resolves thing or not, but it's certainly one that deserves attention.
One practical difficulty with that proposal is that the places where the Chinese companies want to go are the most anti-Chinese, right? So like Texas and places like that. And so, you know, that just, so without even federal restrictions, you could have these restrictions at a local level. But if you look at the US manufacturing workers' productivity, again, it's a myth that Chinese manufacturing is as big as it is because it's efficient. It's not because it's efficient. If you look at the manufacturing output per hour worked, China is right in the middle of the global distribution, about 97 place out of 182 countries. US, its level, the Chinese level is about sort of 30%, 24% of the US level in terms of this particular measure. So I have talked to Chinese entrepreneurs. They had this view that the US manufacturing is inefficient and messy and all of that. Once they begin to operate, they draw the conclusion, actually they can do it. They can, because the manufacturing productivity is actually very high in the United States.
So I don't mean to suggest that China's manufacturing productivity is higher, and it is definitely true that Chinese companies, especially state-owned enterprises, face a lot of pressure from their local governments to hire and not lay off. So that results in like excess labor but I think that there is a lot of evidence about learning in EV manufacturing. You can look at Tesla's like long path to being able to scaling. You can look at GM and their slower than planned ramped up of a bunch of new vehicle programs. There's a lot of evidence on batteries that there's a lot of learning, and you reduce scrappage and you improve efficiency. And this is not about overall manufacturing productivity, but efficiency at doing a particular process and learning that I think is there, especially in battery. And when we got rid of the EV tax credit, we actually removed a lot of barriers to Chinese production of EVs in the US, because that tax credit was really two credits. One was contingent on where the battery was made, and one was contingent on the critical minerals from. And that would have created a big wedge for any vehicle with Chinese batteries, even if it was made in North America, which was a threshold criterion. We took that all away. But you want to talk about critical minerals, and we're like this rogue panel. It's difficult to manage today.
No, but it's fun. Yeah. Not the most well-behaved speakers, but it's fun.
Well, I already talk about toilet paper. That's
Yeah. We
that's
are
very
moving
wrong.
around
Yeah.
a lot. And by the way, maybe you don't know this, but last year we did a seminar on the second China shock and this
So David
excess
Alter,
manufacturing capacity with you here.
Yeah.
And it was the most viewed video on YouTube of the most of our center.
Oh.
Almost 25,000.
The one we did.
The one we
Okay.
did. So if
Well,
you're
this one is
interested
going to
in
surpass that.
if you're interested in excess production of toilet paper, you can go back to that video. But we are almost we have almost to open the floor for debate. I have one last question for you. It's something that we mentioned about electric vehicles. I would like to broaden a little bit the conversation beyond electric vehicles and to look at green tech in general. What's interesting of green tech, where China is the global leader at the moment, ahead also of Europe, is that basically this technology tend to blend hardware and software. And this might create strong dependencies if you adopt, if you decide to import Chinese technology. Do you think there is a plan by Beijing behind this? It's a way for China to create dependencies on other countries that are difficult to be reduced in the future, or not?
I think there's a view that the Chinese policymakers have thought through all these issues and develop a dependency on Chinese products. And then at some point, you jack up the prices to recoup back the lost profitability because you had to cut the prices to establish your market position. I never buy that argument because there are so many Chinese companies in the same product space. So even if they are eliminating foreign competitors, they are not able to eliminate the domestic competitors. As soon as BYD jack up its prices, it's going to suffer because there are so many other Chinese companies. So I don't really worry about that problem. And yet the policy making circle have this dark view of China. And I do worry about using supply chain to weaponize the Chinese foreign policy leverage. That has happened, right? So in the rare earth, it happened to Japan, has happened to Australia, and last summer there was also a threat to basically establish export control on rare earth for all countries. But look at what they have done recently. On Japan, they have relaxed within 1 month of announcing that policy. They have now relaxed the policy, and now they do have a more restrictive policy, but it's not like a total blockade of the rare earth. And in the case of the plan they announced last summer, they never really went very far beyond that announcement. The simple fact is that it's a little bit like weaponizing the dollar, weaponizing the technology that you have. You're hurting the other person, but you're hurting yourself as well. So with the Chinese economy in its current state, I mean, let's just face it, the green technology and the total energy transition sector is about 7% of the Chinese economy. Real estate is 30%. When that sector is going down, no matter how fast you develop the other sector, the economic pressure is very, very, very substantial. So I wouldn't worry too much about that problem. And because I just think that the force of the competition reduces their option value of using that particular strategy.
Any quick reaction before we start the Q&A, or quick comment? Or
I think that China has shown its willingness to use export controls, and that threat is powerful and affects thinking. I think that Trump administration officials, one of their hesitances when I meet with Trump administration, one of their hesitances about EVs is that risk from critical minerals. And while I might weigh different risks more highly, there's a lot of bipartisan focus on diversifying supply chains in critical minerals and rare earths away from China, including the recent announcement of a civilian or commercial rather than non-military rare earth stockpile.
So I think we can start with the Q&A. I see, John, do you want to break
I
the
always
ice?
have questions, but I should let our guests
Okay.
save me a little time because
Can you, okay, because people are watching.
Just to mention, the Wall Street Journal had a piece today about Fuyao glass in the Midwest,
Yeah.
predatory pricing and illegal labor from China. So who
Yeah.
knows? But anyway, to Yasheng's point about the property situation, since 2022, as he well knows, the crash of the property market has had a big impact both upon the economic growth of China, but also disastrous impact on financing for local governments. Now, local governments, I don't know what figures you use, but are probably 80% of most subsidies, including some of the big funds that we talk about in China. So I've been working on this with the Mossavar Center and John on this question. And there's a lot of data that shows that since 2020, the peak in 2023, you see a decline in some of the big guidance funds. You see a huge decline in AI targets from the local level mainly. And so there's a very, very significant drop. You could really argue that for 25 years, China has been awash in cash because of a property bubble. That model is over. So can we say that this is to use a terrible term, inflection point? So the whole subsidy game for tech is gone? Or do you think this is kind of a gradual tapering?
Do you want to react?
Yeah, so I'm much closer to Andrew's reading of the situation, which is that the growth is driving industrial policy rather than industrial policy driving growth, right? So to some extent, it's almost like a self-correcting issue when the economy is going down. Because if you look at the productivity numbers, total factor productivity performance, Chinese economy has been extremely bad at generating productivity. So all these technologies, all these DeepSeek and others have not helped Chinese economy in terms of productivity. When you're not raising productivity, you're going to use more resources to generate the same amount of the output. So essentially, it's the resources chasing the output rather than output generating more resources. I think we are at that point where the shift is probably going into reverse, and the winding down of the EV producers, from 400 to now maybe 90 or 70, it's partially driven by the market dynamics, partially also driven by the dynamics you just laid out, Andrew, that local governments have no money now. Local governments now have no money to pay their own civil servants. And this year, for the first time, I can remember the central government tax intake has deaccelerated, unprecedented in the history of Chinese economy. So I think we are beginning to see something fundamentally shifting in the Chinese economy that would change some of these dynamics. The money simply is no longer there.
Okay, thank you. Here, first row.
Hi, my name is Brian. I'm a first year Master in Public Policy student here. My question is for you as well, Yasheng. Essentially, kind of following along from the last question, do you think that the extreme overcapacity in manufacturing is going to drive significant economic consequences in the near to midterm, kind of like what happened to Japan and having to do the structurally depressed industries policy in the 70s due to their large overcapacity of manufacturing?
So I'm writing a article. The title is China is a Marxist economy. but not the one he championed, but the one he critiqued, right? So if you go back to Marx, the Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, their critique of the free market economy is that capitalists exploit labor, extract labor surplus. And their view is that because of that exploitation, capitalism is chronically prone to crises because you're producing too much, you're consuming too little. And what they call too much civilization, right? In the word of Communist Manifesto. By the way, all these things we have to learn in primary school in China. I thought it was useless, but now it comes back to be very useful now when I'm looking. So ironically, that analysis of market economy, market capitalism applies to Chinese economy today. And so essentially we have, as I pointed out, essentially we have overproduction, under consumption. That formula worked for primarily two reasons, maybe three. One is that Chinese economy was smaller before, but now it's the second largest GDP in the world, biggest trading power. Last year, they had $1.2 trillion of the trade surplus, so it's a massive economy. Secondly, it worked because of the property sector that absorbed some of these capacity. So they have other drivers of the growth that can absorb this. Now, so Trump probably provided some breathing room for China, right? So Canada is allowing 49,000 cars, Chinese cars, to come to Canada, whereas they didn't allow them before. Europe is talking to China to have more of a free trade and with China. So this exit option, the export, is probably a little bit more viable given Trump, right? Not so much Trump relationship with China, but Trump relationship with Canada, with Europe. So maybe there is a more leg, so maybe they can avoid the Japan scenario because this export option is still viable. But I wouldn't put China in the same spot as Japan. China is much lower per capita GDP as compared with Japan in the early 1990s. Japan, let's be clear, Japan was about 75% of the US per capita GDP. China is about 75% of the US aggregate GDP, right? So in terms of per capita GDP, China is about 25%, even lower, 20% as compared with the US. So China has more to go in terms of the economic growth. I think fundamentally, and this is a totally different topic, I think fundamentally China needs to change its economic development strategy by not applying Marxist analysis of the free market economy, by exploiting the labor, and by improving the welfare of the people, by strengthening the social security, health insurance, education, public education, the things that people like us have been advocating for the last 10 years. They need to do that to fundamentally address this imbalance between production and consumption. And that's really a political question, because once they do that, essentially it's a political economy question. Once they do that, they gave more rights to the people, and therefore reducing the discretion and the power of the government. That's a political question rather than an economic question.
Thanks. John, maybe now it's your turn.
So, Yasheng, earlier you had said that you made this distinction between invention and scaling.
Yeah.
And that the US is good at invention, China's good at scaling. And when I think about, like, more than you want to know, I did a joint venture in Shanghai years ago, decades ago. And we were the company I was at, AT&T, was one third partner. And we had a finance partner and we had a technology partner. And it was to build, we were the first company to have a licensed operated telecom network in China. And it was to build a secure trading network for trading equities in the Pudong district of Shanghai. In retrospect, it was very clear that what China wanted was the technology, or what the joint venture wanted was to see the technology. And then they scaled. right? So that's very consistent with your model. If I look at the auto industry today, and I look at the scaling issue and invention issue, Tesla came to China. I think they wanted to see the technology of Tesla, but then they've exceeded that with BYD. Now, I'd like to understand both from you and from Elaine your perspective on why is China good at scaling and why is the US good at invention but not good at scaling, if that's true. And there is also in the scaling issue a kind of question, for example, what's the real cost to China of scaling? And the reason I ask that is because you have these, 900 auto companies funding out of land grants and subsidies through regions. Now you're down to 100. You've got a lot of stranded assets potentially. So is there a big cost to the scaling that the U.S. couldn't incur? Just help me understand why one country is good and one country isn't at the different pieces. In your
Do you want to go first?
No, you go first. Yeah.
So I don't know that I would say the US is bad at scaling just based on these green technologies. I would say that the US has very mixed feelings about renewables and electric vehicles, more so than China. So one is that we are the largest oil producer in the world and probably the largest natural gas producer in the world. And those companies have lots of political power. That is one consideration behind this sort of swinging backwards and forwards about EVs. But I think also, why solar panels, we might not have, we were early in, I think, technology development there, but didn't really scale that. So I think that's a big consideration. There's a movie called, I believe, Who Killed the Electric Car, about GM's EV1 and why they were literally, GM recalled all the vehicles and bought them back. And you can watch this, but I mean, one of the it's sort of a whodunit, and one of the potential murderers in this is the oil industry. So I don't know that I would call it about scaling in general. I would just say it's maybe scaling about these environmental technologies. And Tesla took a long time, but Tesla dominated the domestic EV industry, had over 80% market share. That's come down as others have come to make increasingly good competitors. Took them a while, but they really proved the case for EVs, and EVs that could be not just wimpy, but powerful and desirable for the world.
And if I may let you, I wonder whether this issue of scaling has to do to the fact that for the last 20, almost 30 years, the US has basically outsourced these scaling activities to China.
Foxconn,
Yeah.
Apple and Foxconn.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe they don't scale domestically, and domestically they focus on the high value added steps of production. Maybe they tend to.
So there is actually a paradox with the Foxconn Apple collaboration. Foxconn is based in California. Apple is based in California, and then they do all of that in China with the help from Foxconn. And there's a great book called Apple in China. It's really a fantastic book. So there's a paradox with that because traditionally we think about knowledge as very local. And so you tend to sort of do things locally to scale the technology. And if you look at Cambridge, so near where I work, Kendall Square, they used to have in the 1980s factories, electronic factories. Now you go there, it's all corporate headquarters, right? So Pfizer and Moderna and R&D centers, and then you scale in China. So there's a sort of economic paradox because usually what you want to do is you want to try the local scaling. I think one reason, I'm not saying, John, this is the only reason, we have this intellectual misconception looking down upon scaling and looking up invention, right? Read Peter Thiel's book, From Zero to One. He's all about 0 to 1. And he said, oh, what China can do is just 1 to 100, 100 to 1 million. In fact, you know, if you're involved in hard tech, you would know that, you know, 0 to 1 definitely is like incredible, heroic, and breakthrough. In fact, to take a hard tech from 1 to 100, from 100 to 1 million is incredibly difficult. And yet, in our educational system, in our intellectual circles, and I think this is a fault of sort of liberals, right? Economic liberals, you know, we look down upon that, right? So this is more like a social thing, you know, to help the workers. But to scale hard tech technology requires policy support, policy commitments, time consistency, dedicated engineering talents. So Chinese educational system is not just Tsinghua University and Peking University. I have visited vocational schools, training skilled workers. Some of them are listed on Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Every year, they have like 10,000 people going through their training program. Massive campus, bigger than Harvard and MIT combined, right? There's this massive apparatus behind it. So I think, you know, Kennedy School or another institution should really sort of go a little bit deeper beyond the credit support and things like that. There's a whole social intellectual apparatus behind this setup that enable their success. Whether or not we can learn from it, that's a separate issue, but we need to get that right before we decide whether or not this is right for us.
So we are running out of time. So I want to thank you all for showing up. I want to thank Elaine and Yasheng for their time and the insightful conversation. Thanks a lot. Bye.